John Wesley, the father of Methodism, traveled to the colony of Georgia in 1735 when he was 32 years old. Although the label Methodist had already been loosely applied to him, and although John Wesley himself would later describe his time in Georgia as the second rise of Methodism, he came to Georgia as a voluntary missionary without a specific assignment or placement. His hope was to develop his own holiness so he could then help others live holy lives as well. The reality of the missionary situation in Georgia, along with some relationship challenges, converged to make Wesley's time in America a lesson in failure, a lesson in what can be gained through failure, to be sure. John Wesley's Methodist movement brought an incredible revival to Christianity. It is, in fact, a movement that has continued to revive Christianity for more than 2 centuries. Perhaps his time in Georgia did not produce the results John Wesley had hoped for, but it was the kindling for the fire of revival. Before we look specifically at John Wesley's time in Georgia, a brief voyage through his early years will help us understand what brought him to America. John Wesley was born at Epworth on June 17, 1703. His father Samuel was an Anglican priest appointed to serve the parish of St. Andrew at Epworth. This is a present-day photo of the Epworth Rectory, what we might think of as a parsonage, where John Wesley grew up. This isn't exactly what the house looked like when the Wesleys moved in, though. Their Epworth home actually burned twice, once before John was born. His father Samuel had strong political opinions that sometimes brought him into conflict with the people in his parish. The second arson attempt was in February 1709, when John was just shy of 6 years old. The fire completely destroyed the home. The neighbors saw John in the window of the blazing house up on the second floor, and they formed a human ladder to pluck him out of his second-floor bedroom. From that point on, John Wesley was plucked as a brand out of the fire. John was in fact educated at home until 1714, when he enrolled in and moved to Charterhouse School. He remained a student there until he began his undergraduate work at Oxford at Christ Church in 1720. John earned his bachelor's degree from Christ Church, Oxford at the age of 21, and in 1726 he became a fellow of Lincoln College, where he earned his M.A. The fact that John Wesley was comfortable in academic settings does not diminish the reality that he was looking for practical application of theology in his everyday life. As one historian, Richard Heitzenrader, puts it, the spiritual quest for holiness provided the focus for Wesley's theology. In 1729, John's younger brother Charles joined him at Oxford, and they, together with a few other men, began meeting regularly to encourage one another in their scholarly and religious pursuits. The little band of friends occasionally met together for study, prayer, and religious conversation. They also made sure to receive sacrament regularly, and they kept track of their lives with detailed daily notations in their diaries. Within a year, the group had begun visiting the debtors and condemned felons in nearby Castle Prison, and from there they undertook other charitable opportunities. Before long, the Methodists were spending several hours a week with the poor and the needy in town. This caused their peers to call them such names as the Holy Club and the Bible Moths, and eventually the Methodists. It was a member of the Holy Club who came to Georgia with John and Charles Wesley. They came with the approval of the SPCK, the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, and also its sister group, the SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Of course, getting to Georgia meant crossing the Atlantic Ocean. No airplanes, no cruise liners, no blimps. On Tuesday, October 14th, 1735, John Wesley boarded the Simmons with his brother Charles and two Holy Club colleagues and more than 150 others. In his journal that day, John noted this: "Our end in leaving our native country was not to avoid want, God having given us plenty of temporal blessings, nor to gain the dung or dross of riches or honor, but singly this, to save our souls, to live wholly to the glory of God." The voyage was difficult. 2 months later, they were still off the coast of England, delayed by weather. But they finally arrived at the coast of Georgia on February 6, 1736, after 115 days at sea and after surviving at least 3 major storms. This historical marker in what is now Fort Pulaski National Monument recounts that on February 6, 1736, John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, landed at Peeper, now Cockspur Island, near here, and there preached to his fellow voyagers his first sermon on American soil. This marker also gives us a glimpse into how John's time in Georgia ended. It reads, Wesley returned to England in 1737 after differences with his parishioners. I shook the dust off my feet and left Georgia, he wrote, having preached the gospel there, not as I ought, but as I was able, 1 year and nearly 9 months. But more on that in a minute. During the 115 or so days on board the Simmons, John Wesley became friends with a group of Moravians, Christians of the German Pietist variety. When he arrived in Georgia, John sought out the Moravians. They became spiritual and theological friends and guides for him. He lived with his German friends for a time and then continued to meet with them regularly. John's professed hope in coming to Georgia was, in part, to learn the true sense of the gospel by preaching it to the heathen, meaning the Native American. John Wesley found himself with limited opportunities with 3 diverse groups of people in the colony of Georgia: the Native Americans, the enslaved Africans, and the English colonists. Tomochichi, a local Native American chief with the Creek tribe, expressed to John Wesley his hope that his people would be educated about Christianity, but he also made it clear that he would not allow them to be required to submit to baptism. The chief's own father had been killed by Spanish missionaries when he refused baptism. John and his brother Charles were supposed to meet with Tomochichi and another chief, Senaki, on February 19th, just 2 weeks after arriving. John's journal notes simply, my brother and I took boat passing by Savannah, went to pay our visit in America to the poor heathens, but neither Tomochachi nor Senaki were at home. Of course, this wasn't his only effort at outreach to them, but it is an interesting note in his journal. John found his efforts to spend time with the Native American tribes thwarted. The people in charge of the colony, especially its founder and the one who invited John to come, Oglethorpe, he didn't want John Wesley to be absent from Savannah. And in reality, there were others who were tasked with jobs like teaching, reading, and writing to the Creek children. In fact, one of John and Charles's original Oxford colleagues, Benjamin Ingham, was so tasked, and in the process lived close to the Creek tribe and learned to speak the Creek language. When John did spend time with the Native Americans, he found that Tomochachi's indications that the Native Americans were eager, or at least willing, to learn about Christianity were perhaps overstated. Instead of willing ears, John found the opposite. He wrote, they show no inclination to learn anything, but least of all Christianity, being full as opinionated of their own parts and wisdom as either modern Chinese or ancient Roman. In other words, the Native Americans already had a fully developed belief system, and they weren't particularly eager to hear about John's. He further noted in his journal that the people of the Creek tribe were infected with European vices, including the insatiate love of drink. Of course, John Wesley's mission was not only to the Native Americans of Savannah. We'll talk momentarily about his work with the colonists of Savannah, but it's worth noting that he spent time with enslaved people as well. One of the stated goals or purposes of his sponsor, the SPG, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, was, quote, the conversion of Negro slaves. John Wesley's opportunities were apparently sporadic. He met with several slaves at a church in Charleston in August 1736. He noted that he was disheartened by how much they didn't know about the Christian basics. The following April, he met with and provided instruction in the basics of the Christian faith, what we might call catechism, to an enslaved girl. She absorbed everything he said and found great hope in it. He repeated this effort then with a young man in another town, and this led him to conclude that a program should be worked out with the white landowners to allow this kind of instruction. But it seems that the overall size of his parish, 200 miles across, and his relatively short time in the colony prevented this idea from really coming to fruition. John was, however, staunchly opposed to slavery and the correlated inhumane treatment of people. During his time in Georgia, most of John Wesley's time was spent with the colonists of Savannah. Remember, he left England in 1735, arrived in Georgia in 1736, February 1736. Within a month, he preached for the first time in Savannah proper. He used 1 Corinthians 13 and Luke 18, but in addition, Wesley also apprised the parishioners of his intention to abide by the ecclesiastical regulations of the Church of England. In other words, the order of the church mattered to him, no matter how far he was from Canterbury. In Savannah and also in the nearby town of Frederica, John Wesley helped people set up small groups for the purpose of meeting together, for Christian singing, reading, and conversation. John was especially active in the Savannah group, and he reported to the SPCK in February 1737, "Sometime after the evening service on Sunday afternoon, as many of my parishioners as desire it, meet at my house, as they do likewise on Wednesday evening, and spend about an hour in prayer, singing, reading a practical book, and mutual exhortation. A smaller number, mostly those who desire to communicate the next day, meet here on Saturday evening, and a few of these come to me on other evenings and pass half an hour in the same employments." The attendance at public worship had grown steadily since his coming, and increased to 60 to 80 persons by the fall of 1737. In that year, 1737, Wesley published a collection of psalms and hymns, the first English hymn book to be published in America. He organized the book according to the agenda of the Methodist meetings. There were 3 sections: Psalms and hymns for Sunday, including those proper for general worship; Psalms and hymns for Wednesday or Friday, with a focus on confession and repentance; and the 3rd section was Psalms and hymns for Saturday, with a focus on praising God the Creator. A reprint of the book notes in the prologue that it, quote, "strikingly illustrates Wesley's care to provide for the spiritual wants of those committed to his care, his earnest and serious temperament, and his prominent ecclesiasticism." Although John's brother Charles would later become a prolific hymn writer, this early work didn't include any hymns by Charles. It did, however, include hymns written by John's father Samuel Wesley and his eldest brother, also named Samuel. Ultimately, however, John's time in Savannah came to an abrupt end. His dedication to ecclesiastical or church order was not always well received by the people of Savannah, who were working so hard to establish a colony, to build something new. Early on, John was asked to baptize the infant of a prominent couple, Mr. and Mrs. Parker. The mother, however, wanted the baby sprinkled with water. John was inflexible, saying he could make an exception to immersion only if the baby was weak. The couple went elsewhere for the baptism, and John made an enemy. One of the parishioners John grew close to in Savannah was a young woman named Sophia Hopkey. She surprised John by marrying William Williamson. John felt he had grounds under the Book of Common Prayer to deny her communion, and so he did. This made her husband angry, and he went to Sophie's uncle, who also happened to be the chief magistrate. Williamson filed suit for defamation of character, and a grand jury of 44 people voted 32 to 12 to indict John on 10 counts, claiming he had deviated from the principles and regulations of the established church in several ways, including refusing communion to people and refusing to baptize the Parkers' baby. Over the course of the fall, John Wesley went to court to defend himself on several occasions, but the trial was repeatedly delayed. By December, he decided he was ready to leave the colony. He posted a notice in the main town square in Savannah declaring his intention to leave. The magistrate responded by publishing an order requiring him to stay. Wesley was not persuaded. He took a boat downriver and then walked through dense forest and swamp, getting lost several times, and then finally, 3 days later, arrived at a place where he could catch a boat to Charleston and then to England. As historian Heisenrader notes, his enemies never enjoyed the pleasure of John Wesley's conviction. Wesley jumped bail and abruptly departed from the colony in December 1737 before any trial could be held. John Wesley did, in fact, leave the New World for the Old World on December 22, 1737. All in all, John Wesley's time in America did not produce the fruit he had hoped for, but it did in fact produce fruit. In addition to the pastoral work that happened with individuals over his 21 months in Georgia, and the hymn book he created, and the groundwork he laid for those who followed him, John Wesley himself called his time in Georgia the second rise of Methodism. The first rise was his time in Oxford, that period from 1720 until he left for Georgia. Then his time in Georgia. And then his third rise of Methodism immediately followed this time in Georgia on his return to London. It was en route to Georgia and in Georgia that John Wesley met and established relationships with the Moravians, a group that would be instrumental in the Methodist movement in England. Georgia was also a time of personal growth, perhaps a sharpening by fire for this brand once plucked from the fire, leading him to conclude that God had humbled him, proved him, and shown him what was in his heart. So we conclude by returning to the original question: was John Wesley's time in America a lesson in failure? Perhaps it's more accurate to say it was a lesson in one faithful man's journey. Georgia was the necessary fuel for the fire that would later leave his heart feeling strangely warmed.